Good evening and a very warm welcome to Lancaster Priory this evening for this evening's lecture. Now, I know that we all love tales of serpentine machinations in a super Gothic setting, but unfortunately we're not talking about today's goings-on in the Houses of Parliament. We're delighted to welcome Sarah Perry and enter into the wonderful world of her imagination. I love the quote which says that had Charles Dickens and Bram Stoker come together to write the great Victorian novel, would it have surpassed the Essex Serpent? Well, it's a treat to welcome her this evening to talk to us, and I'm delighted to hand over to Andy, who is going to do a proper introduction now that I've welcomed you on behalf of the Priory to this lovely Gothic church for this evening's lecture. Andy.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you to the Priory for welcoming us for our second annual lecture, jointly hosted by the Priory and the Department of English Literature and Creative Writing. It's good to see you all, and so thank you for joining us this evening. And we're really delighted that Sarah Perry is this year's speaker. A little bit of background on Sarah. She holds a PhD from Royal Holloway, London, where she wrote on Iris Murdoch and Gothic literature, and in 2018 became a Fellow of the Royal Society of Literature. She's been writer-in-residence at Gladstone's Library, and more recently, writer-in-residence at the Savoy Hotel for a month. So that's a pretty nice gig. I'm going to be looking into how she got into that. Sarah is a wholly exceptional writer. Her three novels, After Me Comes the Flood, The Essex Serpent that Chris mentioned, which was Waterstone's Book of the Year 2016, and Mammoth that came out in 2018, are rich, distinctive, and thrilling. Sarah is a novelist of ideas, but a novelist of ideas whose plots are very much embodied in human lives that we believe in, and richly evoked landscapes too. Her work, I think, treats its readers with a rare sense of respect. She challenges us in lots of ways. She delights in language. She explores complex problems. There's always a sense that there is something at stake in these books. She refuses to deny the strange ways in which human beings behave. The Priory seems like the perfect sacred space to hear Sarah's words read aloud too. For me, they have a real sense of theological and ethical depth. Mammoth, published as I said last year, rewrites Charles Maturin's Gothic novel, but it does much more than that. It explores ethical failure, the long afterlife of guilt, the desire for personal and collective redemption. Alex Preston in The Guardian described the novel as a masterly piece of postmodern Gothic and one of the great literary achievements of our young century, one that deserves all the prizes and praise that will be heaped upon it. And you know what? He's absolutely right. Please give a very warm welcome to Sarah Perry.
Good evening. I'm very grateful to Chris and to John and Andrew for their very kind invitation to what is, I think, the most appropriate venue in which I've ever had the privilege to speak. I'm grateful to you all for coming out on what's a slightly unpromising evening, both meteorologically and politically. When I set out to prepare this evening's lecture, I began to think of a series of drawers or compartments containing objects which have nothing to do with each other, save that they were all chosen by the same eye and set aside by the same hand. My memory then slid back 20 years, and I remembered standing in a corridor at school waiting with the rest of class to go to morning assembly, and in that corridor there was a large pine chest containing many small drawers. Each drawer had a brass handle and a brass label holder, and none of the drawers were labelled. Nobody else paid it any attention at all, so that as I look back, I actually wonder whether I imagined it, but whenever I could contrive to stand next to it, I would open the drawers and see little packets of white tissue paper containing objects I couldn't see. And when I had time, I used to open them with my finger and see what was inside. I can't actually remember a single item I saw there. Then I suppose one day it was no longer there, or I'd begun to be more interested in the gossip and politics that make school very interesting or very tiresome, depending on your character, and stopped paying it attention. But this idea of items gathered together, all with some meaning, which is either immediately apparent or forever obscured, has recurred to me over and over again. The collection and curation of little objects has appeared in all of my novels, and I dare say will continue to do so. And I want to use that motif this evening as a means to explore incidents and influences which have caused me to write what I have written in the way that I have written it. I'm going to read briefly from my debut, After Me Comes the Flood, for reasons which I think will become immediately clear. In this passage, rather a strange young woman called Claire has brought down a chest of drawers from the attic, which has been abandoned for 50 or 60 years, and she is opening a series of packets. It was early still, and there ought to have been dew on the grass, but already the hard-baked earth had stored up the morning sun, and John felt it through the thin soles of his shoes. The forest pines huddled against the garden wall were shedding their needles to lighten their load, and up ahead an elm had been struck with disease so that half its branches were damned to perpetual winter. In the shade of the elm, Claire, in her white shirt, knelt over a series of irregular white objects which might have fallen from the blighted elm. Drawing near, John saw they were a dozen small parcels wrapped in paper and tied with waxed string. Several opened out and surrounded with scraps of paper in the long grass. Seeing John come towards her, the girl snatched up a clay doll, shook its ugly head, and sent them away. "You can't have her, she's mine." So what I would like us to do is to imagine that we are not in Lancaster on a very ill-tempered March evening, but out on a parched lawn in East Anglia, taking out these little packages, unwrapping them, and finding them, I hope, not only some constituents of my work, but some illumination regarding the pursuit of literature generally, and in fact all of our shared tendency to be more than the sum of our various parts. So I want you to imagine that we are opening the largest drawer and taking out, rather predictably I'm afraid, a King James Bible. It is not, however, a large and handsome leather Bible with gilded edges, as you might expect to see on a lectern in a church, but a battered, cheap black hardback with pink sprayed edges, and on the front, a large sticker from the Ford Motor Company, and other stickers too which I have forgotten. And written on the first page in felt-tip pen is the name Sarah Butler. And very many passages and verses in the Bible have been underlined in biro or highlighted in yellow and occasionally annotated in what is very clearly a child's handwriting, but also very clearly mine. Occasionally I hesitate to explain how it was that I came to write novels so nakedly preoccupied with the nature of faith and superstition and madness, and with the nature of good and what it means to be good. And in fact, as a friend said to me the other day, which shocked me speechless, whether or not one even ought to try to be good, because my own experience seems commonplace and familiar and seems hardly worth repeating. But at an event in Essex last week, a lady in the front row took the microphone and leaned forward and said, "So, Sarah, where was it you were a nun?" So I'm going to take the liberty of talking briefly about my upbringing, which did so much to form not only my imagination and my consciousness, but the cadences in which I write. I was born in Essex in 1979, and my parents were members of a strict Baptist chapel. Now, it's very important to me that you understand that there is a capital S there, as well as a capital B. They were not Baptists who were strict. They were, and I was, strict Baptists. Now, to my knowledge, there's only ever been one famous strict Baptist, and his name was Archibald Ormsby Gore. He was a very enthusiastic amateur archaeologist, particularly interested in excavating molehills, which he believed to be the graves of baby druids. He was, as some of you may be aware, John Betjeman's teddy bear. And this is all absolutely true, incidentally, and he inspired the teddy bear in Brideshead Revisited. The chapel my parents attended, and which was as much a focus of my life for the first 18 years as the home that I lived in, was called Ebenezer. This name derives from a cairn of stones built by the Israelites after they had a successful skirmish with the Philistines, and it means, "Hitherto hath the Lord helped us." I often say, only half in jest, that I was born in 1860. But it is in some ways the best way I can account for what I can remember of my childhood, which is that I lived a far remove from everything you would associate with a childhood in the 1980s and the 1990s. We did not have television, we're not allowed to go to the cinema, certainly didn't listen to pop music. I have 4 elder sisters, and one of them smuggled into the house a double cassette tape of the hits of Elvis Presley, which we listened to in her bedroom very quietly with our ear next to the tape recorder, and which my father found and threw in the dustbin. Never went to school discos or anything along those lines. I was encouraged to listen to classical music, which I did at enormous volume, because my father was quite deaf, and I still listen to it at enormous volume. And I read very widely with an appetite that was killed by an MA in creative writing, which I've been trying to resuscitate ever since. I sat in the space between the sofa and the window, reading the dictionary. I sat in the dining room table, reading the encyclopedias. I hid in the attic and read Shakespeare's Rape of Lucrece, which was nothing like as violent as I'd hoped it would be. I read Jane Eyre by mistake when I was 8, and when I was 10, my father gave me a copy of Tess of the D'Urbervilles. Above all, I read the King James Bible. Not, I confess, very often for pleasure or on my own prompting. Rather, it was read aloud at breakfast and at dinner time. We memorised passages to recite at memory verse competitions. It was read at enormous length from the Ebenezer pulpit, often long reaches of kind of Levitical law or genealogies in which someone begat somebody else for hundreds and hundreds of years. Now, I'm not going to inflict my autobiography on you because it's not very interesting, but I do think it's profitable to wonder what effect this saturation in Scripture has had on my work, because in an increasingly secular age, I often wonder what it does to a writer to cut their teeth on religious thought and expression, and what will happen when, in due course, the last writer, raised on the King James Bible, publishes their last book. There were 2 effects, I think, one of which is more interesting than the other. The first is to do with aesthetics and ethics. From birth, and I really do mean from birth, the single most constant sound in my life are the cadences of the Bible. It's very difficult for anyone raised on the English Standard Bible or the NIV to understand how intoxicating it is to hear that music, because it is music. It was always intended to be spoken aloud. It was not written in the everyday patterns of colloquial speech, but supposed to be kind of elevated above it. Every day, over and over, my whole life. Listen to this phrase from Isaiah, and you'll hear it like a song. "How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning," which is dactylic trimeter, I think. Someone can correct me later. And then there is an exquisite balancing of words and ideas. This is from Isaiah again. "But they that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings as eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint." So I began to receive the idea, which is not by any means an original one, that beauty and moral virtue were in some ways inextricably linked. That noble and difficult ideas not only could be conveyed in rich and beautiful prose, but that they ought to be. And in fact, that beauty and moral virtue are very nearly the same thing. Now, this is an extraordinarily old-fashioned view. It's virtually risible nowadays and demands far more examination than I can give it this evening, or probably over the course of a whole year. But it is a view that I hold slightly against my better judgment. When I've cast about for some sort of bolstering philosophy, I've turned not to Christian writings, but to the Greeks and to their ideas regarding good and noble behaviour. The phrase kalos kagathos was used to describe a certain kind of courtly, noble, gentlemanly behaviour that was also applied to women, interestingly, for the Greeks. It comprises adjectives describing both the beautiful and the good. Aristotle, in his Ethics, proposed that a virtuous person will derive pleasure from an act which is noble or beautiful or both. Here and elsewhere in Greek philosophy, the idea of beauty and nobility is conflated. And it's really not such a vast leap from this idea to examine how we come to use the same word, good, to mean both a moral and virtuous act, and also a work of art which has intellectual and aesthetic pleasures. So when I say, this is a good book, what do I mean? When I say, I want to write good books, what do I intend? At a debate a couple of years ago, maybe 4 years ago actually, with some fellow writers, all of whom were much my senior in sort of seniority and status, I said that I felt that I had a set of moral and ethical obligations in writing, and that I felt my book should have moral virtue in the same way that one's life surely ought to. I can only say that this was not a view that was widely shared, and I said very little for the remainder of the seminar. But I can never see the act of writing as separate from all the other acts which constitute a virtuous life. Whatever motivates me, or does not motivate me, I'm afraid I'm very much the sinner my father insisted I was. An attempt to translate good or virtuous intentions into acts doesn't turn off like a tap when I sit down to write. I can't lift my writing out of all of my promptings because it is art. Goodness is not a matter of thought, but of conduct, and my writing is my conduct. I am by no stretch of the imagination an expert on ethics or moral philosophy, but I'm very attached to Iris Murdoch's The Sovereignty of Good, in which she debates the nature of good. Is it an act? Is it a series of acts? Is it merely thought? Is it a process of thought? Is it a kind of abstract yet somehow solid thing that we should aim for? And she concludes that it is love and not beauty which is most analogous to goodness. And she says, there is nevertheless something about the conception of a refined love which is practically identical with goodness. Will not act lovingly translate act perfectly, whereas act rationally will not. It is tempting to say so. Good is the magnetic centre towards which love naturally moves. Incidentally, a couple of books have been published, a wide acclaim in the last few years, which I consider to fall far short of the base kind of standard for virtue in books, and they've been wildly popular. I will tell you afterwards, if you come out and have a fag with me, what they are. I was in a branch of Waterstones with a young person of my acquaintance, and she picked up one of these books and showed every kind of intention of buying it. I said, oh, that's a wicked book. And she said, oh, is it? I'll get it then. And I had to explain that I was born in 1860, and the word wicked only has one meaning for me. So. The second thing I want to say regarding the influence of the King James Bible requires us to open another drawer in the cabinet and take out another book. I think you'll be pleased and relieved to see that this one is a handsome 16th century volume, absolutely immense, Fox's Book of Martyrs. A work really second only to the King James Bible in its influence on the English consciousness. In fact, I have a theory that Fox's Book of Martyrs is to blame for Brexit, but that's another lecture, so I shall develop that at some later stage. This book falls open easily at a woodcut engraving and 2 columns of Gothic black type. The woodcut shows a young woman with her head wrapped in a piece of cloth, holding a jug in her right hand. She is surrounded by men, and one of them is holding a candle under her left hand. This is Rose Allen. She was a girl of 18 who lived in Colchester, an Essex girl like me, and in 1557 she was arrested in her home for the offence of worshipping according to her conscience. The day she was arrested, her mother was ill and had asked Rose to bring her a jug of water. That's why she's holding a jug in her hand. And Rose, in her testimony, said, when the men came for her, it occurred to her that she could bring down the earthenware jug on his head and free herself from their clutches. And she said, by the grace of God, I did not. When she was questioned, her interrogator took one of the candles which was lighting the room and moved it back and forth across the back of her hand until the tendons audibly snapped. His intention was to frighten her into giving up her faith by giving her a little taste of the martyr's fire. She was burned alive at Colchester Castle later that same year. Now, I was not brought up to venerate the Protestant martyrs in quite the same way a Catholic child might have venerated the saints, but very, very nearly. Throughout the year, we would visit Martyrs memorials all over East Anglia and hold little memorial services, often under pouring rain and to a sort of puzzled but generally benign and indifferent public. From a very young age, I would sit on my knees in my father's study with his edition of Fox open on my knees and memorise the gruesome series of torments to which Christian martyrs had been subjected. And I was particularly admiring of Rose Allen because she was a young woman, and stories of female heroism, particularly in young women, were always very thin on the ground. And also because the details of her torture were so particular and so terrible. I recall once as a young child burning my finger striking a match, and my father, who was not an unkind man, telling me that I ought to think about that pain and imagine what it would be like to burn for all eternity as a lost sinner in a literal hell. But actually all I could think of was Rose Allen. Later, when we open another drawer, you will remember my predilection for reading about torture. Importantly, what I failed to understand for many years, and what I now know, is that both Fox's Book of Martyrs and the King James Bible were, in their very different ways, beautiful, of course, aesthetically pleasing, compendiums of extraordinary storytelling, but also radical political texts. I think it's because of this that I have always imagined that the best fiction inhabits that same space, having its cake and eating it, if you like. That the Platonic ideal of a novel is that it should be a novel of ideas, have moral virtue, be a cracking yarn, be beautifully written, and be political. I strongly doubt that I will ever write anything reaching this ideal, but, what is life but trying? Middlemarch, I think, is probably the book that best exemplifies this ideal, but there are many, many books which you could consider to pass that test. Funnily enough, Vonnegut was someone that I thought of. He has a moral purpose that shines throughout all of his kind of levity and imagination that's really quite extraordinary. It may seem bizarre to cast the King James Bible, of all the pillars of the artistic and literary establishment, the biggest and the most solid, as a radical text. But of course it is, because what it represents is the battle for political and religious freedom against an oppressive state. William Tyndale, whose translation constitutes a large constituent part of what eventually became the King James Bible, was a single-minded and utterly reckless political radical. This is not to say that he was not also motivated by a profound religious faith, but rather to suggest that in contrast to the kind of political religious vector that we commonly see today, it's highly debatable, but when one thinks of fundamentalist or evangelical Christians nowadays, you tend to think of broadly right-wing politics, and for reasons that will remain forever obscure to me, a climate change denial, which is completely illogical, because if you're a creationist, you'd think you'd be recycling like Billy-O, but never mind. Tyndale's radical religious feeling coexisted with radical anti-establishment feeling. As a young man at Oxford, already seized with the desire to see the Bible available in English, which incidentally carried capital punishment if you were to attempt it, he was riled by an academic who said it would be better to be without God's word than to be without the Pope's. Tyndale very famously retorted that he defied the Pope and all his laws absolutely, and that if God spared him, he said, "I will cause the boy that driveth the plough to know more of the Bible than thou doest." Of course, this represents a desire to see common men and women easily accessing the Word of God for the betterment of their souls, but it is more than that. When the state and the church conspire together to rule the conscience of citizens by not permitting them access to Scripture, they are also conspiring to keep every other form of thought down. If you subjugate religious feeling, you subjugate political will too. If the church teaches that God ordained that the rich man should be in his castle and the poor man should be at his gate, and the poor man has no means of finding out for himself that Christ proposed a broadly socialist social society, the poor man will always be grateful for the rich man's scraps. Tyndale's promise came decades later into fruition, but not before exile, imprisonment, torture, and martyrdom. Before King James saw to it that there was a Bible in English chained up in every church pulpit in the land, copies of Tyndale's New Testament were smuggled over the channel in wine casks, and when the bishops found them, 6,000 New Testaments were burned on the steps of St. Paul's. I find that completely extraordinary. It's so tempting nowadays, whatever your religious or irreligious flavour, to look at these great big dusty Bibles and see them as being sort of obscure and dated. But actually what you are looking at is a revolution, a political one, a religious one, and one of the will of the common man. It's an extraordinary thing. The Bible that was read to me every day, and the book of Martyrs that gave me a lifelong fascination with pain and mutilated bodies, were, I think, the two most dangerous books to have ever been produced in the English language. And they left me with a sense that of all the artistic endeavours, it is writing which is the most powerful and the most persuasive. I've had rows with musicians about this, but I'm sure we all agree that I'm correct. In the Essex Serpent, I included a character who was deeply, deeply moved and motivated by Marx. Her name was Martha. She was raised to socialism in much the same way that I was raised to Protestant Christianity. And I wrote a brief passage intending to suggest the power of language, beautiful language in particular. The Communist Party Manifesto is an extraordinary work of literature, quite apart from its contents. The power of beautiful language to convey ideas which are grand and radical in a fashion which has a kind of hypnotic resonance. In fact, almost a religious resonance, even when religion has nothing at all to do with it. I must now find page 106. Thank you for your patience. I did have a bookmark, but I think I wrapped my chewing gum in it. So. This is Martha. Martha's socialism was no less ingrained than any inherited faith still clung to past childhood fervour. Community halls and picket lines were her temples, and Annie Besant and Eleanor Marx stood at the altar. She had no hymn book, but the fury of folk songs setting English suffering to English melody. In the kitchen of their Whitechapel rooms, her father, hands reddened with brick dust, the whorls of his fingertips worn smooth, counted out his wages and set aside his union fees, and in his careful handwriting joined the petitioning of Parliament for a 10-hour limit on a working day. Her mother, who'd once stitched stoles and copes with golden crosses and pelicans picking out their hearts, cut cloth for banners held high above the picket line, and eked out the household budget to take beef soup to the striking match girls at Bryant and May. All that is solid melts into air, her father had said, reverently reciting his Apostles' Creed, and all that is holy is profaned. Martha, don't bow your head to the way things are and always were. Whole empires are brought down by nothing but ivy and time. He washed his shirts in the small tin bath. The water came out red. He sang as he wrung the linen dry. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the Englishman? When Martha walked from Limehouse to Covent Garden, she saw not high windows and Doric columns, but the labourers toiling behind them. It seemed to her that the city's bricks were red with the blood of its citizens, its mortar pale with the dust of their bones, that deep in its foundations, women and children lay head to toe in buried ranks, bearing up the city on their backs. With all this talk of ethics and politics and striving after what is virtuous and radical, I'm afraid I'm sounding both slightly hubristic and a bit of a prig, so we will return Tyndale and King James to their drawers and open another one instead. This one is much smaller and it is locked, but I have the key. It contains a small phial of clear glass with a glass lid sealed with string and wax and a label which is rather stained with a sticky substance. The label reads, "Genuine Black Drop, prepared by J.A. Braithwaite, Lancaster. Black drop was a preparation of opium made palatable with the addition of vinegar, spices, and treacle. And it's what Samuel Taylor Coleridge relied on to relieve the pain he felt from an eye infection and a gammy knee. I've included it here in my little chest of drawers because in the past 2 or 3 years, probably the single greatest influence on my line of thought and work has been pain and the treatment of pain. And it is interesting particularly because it led me to conclude that the body of work which we think of as opium poems and opium novels should be more properly thought of as pain poems and pain novels. It's quite amusing for us to remember that there was a time when the consumption of opiates did not come accompanied with any sense of shame, never mind a fact of illegality. It was for some decades a commonplace solution to physical pain and also to a sort of shiftless psychic pain. In the East Anglian fens, depressed and overworked fen workers called it elevation because of its ability to lift the spirits. It was, as we all know, prescribed for colic in horses and in babies, for coughs and colds, and household pharmacopoeias list dozens of different uses for the stuff. They seem to regard it as no more dangerous than a drop of tea tree oil. But its effects on the psyche, and in particular on the imagination, were noted very early on in its use. The first opium poem was by a woman. Her name was Mary Robinson. One night in Bath, suffering from a lifetime of chronic pain, she took 80 drops of laudanum, which is a tincture of opium and alcohol, fell asleep on her sofa, and more or less in her sleep composed a long poem called The Maniac. In her opiate haze, the sight of a vagrant on the streets in Bath was transformed into a series of vivid and sinister visions. It's not one of the great works of the English canon, but it is a remarkable artifact at the very beginning of literary drug culture. When eventually it became apparent that opium had addictive qualities that could circumscribe a life just as much as the pain that it was being taken to relieve, shame began to attend its use. It's very interesting that it was at that point that people began to feel ashamed of it because they had fallen weakly beneath the spell of a substance. Samuel Taylor Coleridge felt that shame deeply, and he said, "I never sought pleasure for its own sake, only as a means of escaping the pains that coiled around my mental powers as a serpent around the body and the wings of an eagle." Predictably, for a child of strict Baptists, I had always held drug culture in a sort of fond contempt. I loved Coleridge despite his weakness, not because of it, and I would never have sought out a writer because of a sort of supposed glamour attending a bottle of amphetamine stored next to a typewriter. And Susan Sontag wrote on speed, which I now, in my old age, begin to see as quite a sensible approach. So it is with complete astonishment that I look back on the past year or so and see that I, who really think of Middlemarch's Casaubon as who I would most like to be, wrote a novel while high. In 2016, my body weakened by a chronic illness. I ruptured a disc so severely that the disc matter filled my spinal canal completely and crushed my sciatic nerve. I'm always very gratified to find that I need not elaborate any further because people tend to turn a little pale when I tell them. The pain I endured was so tremendous that I still can't really talk about it without losing a certain amount of sang-froid. So I will only say that for many, many weeks I was, by virtue both of the pain I suffered and the opiates and tranquilizers and nerve blockers I took to relieve it, absolutely out of my mind. This is a very useful phrase. When I say that I was out of my mind, I mean that I actually lifted out of it. Occasionally, I would find I was standing in the corner of the room where I lay howling into a mattress, looking down at myself with total disapproval and disbelief. I always imagined that I was making a terrible fuss at the time. At other times, I found that my imagination, a muscle that's been really overworked for a solid 35 years, began to be indistinguishable from memory or from observation. So for the first time in my life, I encountered my characters sharing the same physical space as their creator. One night, I woke up, rose up through the sort of fortification of medication I was on, and Mammoth the witness was in the corner of the room on a dining chair. The problem of pain has traditionally left writers at something of a loss. Virginia Woolf, who was prone to headaches and the flu, wrote, "We have no words for the shiver or the headache." Actually, that sentence eats itself alive if you think about it, but I take her point. I always took her at her word, but during my own time of pain, I was left with almost nothing to think of but my pain. Where it was, what was the cause, what medication could alleviate it, if any at all, how soon could I take it was always the number one consideration. Nothing else, not what to eat, not when to eat it, not what I ought to wear, and certainly none of the other matters that normally keep me occupied occurred to me at all. I had only pain, and because my imagination was to a certain extent liberated by the drugs I took, I sometimes think tramadol doesn't actually alleviate pain, it just makes you sort of think about something else for a time. The experience became a kind of exercise absolutely invaluable to a writer in devising a taxonomy of suffering. Virginia Woolf could have done with consulting the Greek physician Galen, who identified 4 kinds of pain: the pulsinating, the lancinating, the weighty, and the stretching. And then in the 11th century, the Persian polymath Avicenna added more to it. He added the soft. Quite like the idea of a soft pain. Is that a massage, do you think? The creaking, the coarse, the penetrating, the bitter, and the numb. When, after neurosurgery on my spine, the pain dwindled down to what the medics euphemistically called discomfort, and I no longer needed to travel with a little pouch of medication that could have seen me in a twilight state for a really nice 24 hours, I found that I had on my hands an almost completed manuscript of what can really only be called an opium novel. I will never know whether Mammoth would have been written in the way it was written if I had not been under the influence of both pain and pain relief. But it seems to me that the book has a kind of reckless quality it might not otherwise have had. To write a book which is a supernatural horror novel is not something I ever really intended, and there are passages in it now which I look on with something like shock. And what I have come to understand is that there is something in the experience of pain which is very like the experience of being under the influence of drugs to relieve pain. It forces the imagination past all its usual boundaries, because that degree of suffering demands, forces a flight from the body. Elaine Scarry wrote a remarkable book called The Body in Pain. In it, she argues that pain obliterates language. I've grappled with this proposition because in my experience it didn't obliterate language, because language was all I had left. It sort of expanded the canon, so to speak, but that's her contention. And she wrote this remarkable paragraph. Regardless of the setting in which he suffers, home, hospital, or torture chamber, and regardless of the cause of his suffering, disease, burns, torture, or malfunctioning of the pain network itself, the person in great pain experiences his own body as the agent of his agony. The ceaseless, self-announcing signal of the body in pain, at once so empty and so undifferentiated and so full of blaring adversity, contains not only the feeling, my body hurts, but my body hurts me. This part of the pain, like all others, is usually invisible to anyone outside the boundaries of the sufferer's body, though it sometimes becomes visible when a young child or an animal in the first moments of acute distress, takes maddening flight, fleeing from its own body as though it were a part of the environment it could leave behind. I was so struck by the idea of a maddening flight and of poems like Kubla Khan and even Mammoth as being an example of the mind taking maddened flight from the body. When I reflect on Mammoth, and I'll read from it shortly, I'm left wondering whether what influenced the writing of that book most of all was not the opiates but the pain itself. Incidentally, there are 2 books coming out this year which focus specifically on the female body and pain, which I recommend to you. One of them is Constellations by Sinead Gleeson, which I think is out in a week or 2. And then later this year, Notes Made While Falling by Jen Ashworth of this parish, which I'm looking forward to very much. As a woman of faith, albeit an extremely lax and troubled kind, I also wondered, of course, what place pain has in the story of God's love for his people, other than that in traditional Christian thinking, pain is a sort of unfortunate side effect of the fall. We don't have time this evening to follow that trail, but Joanna Bork's book, The Story of Pain, contains an excellent chapter on how suffering across all Christian traditions was conceived of as a means of obliterating the sinful self and drawing nearer to Christ, especially in allowing a deeper understanding of his suffering. She quotes, rather marvellously, a 19th century Baptist potato salesman named Guire, who claimed that he was in a happy state of mind through enduring such excruciating pain, wholly resting upon the merits of Jesus and trusting that all would be for the best. I'm afraid I read that and thought, you want to try a ruptured disc, mate. Thinking about the good Lord won't do you any good then. I'm going to briefly read a passage from Mammoth dealing with pain. This is an episode set in Manila, where I lived for a time as a missionary, in fact, in 2001. There is a woman called Rosa who has been victim of a very, very severe acid attack, and her case was based on the case of a man in Bristol, a Belgian man in Bristol, who died late last year of his burns after a terrible acid attack. Helen, who is the lead character, has been visiting Rosa in this hospital and really is driven to wonder whether there comes a point at which the sin of killing someone is less than the sin of allowing them to go on suffering. So this is a description of Helen visiting Rosa in hospital. Rosa was not the same as Helen remembered. Her liquid eyes had acquired somehow the same fine layer of dust and neglect that lay on the tiled floor. She huddled against the far side of the bed as if forced to share the mattress with an unwelcome stranger. In her distress, she rocked back and forth. In doing so, she tugged at the sheet, and Helen saw for a brief, shocked moment the body beneath it and the damage done. It took a great effort of will merely to stand beside the bed, beside the stool, and say, "Rosa, Rosa, I am here. Do you remember me? Do you know me?" She waited. A window was half open. Scarlet bougainvillea seeped across the windowsill and dripped petals on the floor. "Rosa," said Helen. Someone moved past the window and stopped. There was the sound of tools striking hard surfaces outside. A man laughed, was silent, laughed again, and clicked on the radio. "Rosa," said Helen, steadily, slowly, as if questioning a child. "Rosa, do you really want to die?" The face turned towards her, softened. "I never called you Arte," she said. "I should have called you Arte Rosa, my older sister. I haven't got anything right, have I?" The hand beneath Helen's twisted and moved palm upward. The thin fingers threaded through hers, and very faintly Helen felt the stroking of a moving thumb. "Thank you," said Rosa. "Thank you." "But I've done nothing," said Helen. Her hand was wet with sweat. "I've done nothing." "Thank you," said Rosa, and for a long moment her eyes looked lovingly at Helen. more lovingly, she thought, than any eyes had ever done, and she arched back against the bed and began to wail. It was angrily done, the howling of a woman who knows herself beyond the remedies of justice. The question of ethics is never far from my mind, and what occupied me most when writing, I think this scene in particular, but the many scenes of pain and suffering in Mammoth, was how I would affect the reader and to what extent I risked forcing the reader to be complicit in suffering. There is a way of writing trauma which has a kind of delicious quality to it, the suggestion that it is sating an ignoble appetite in the reader. This is an appetite we all share. Think of me as a child reading the worst bits of Fox. The desire to hear the details, to screw out just one more line of exactly what pain was visited on a body and exactly where. This becomes particularly troublesome, I think, when writing about real or historical trauma, which I did in Mammoth. I was conscious that I risked not only exploiting the suffering of others by writing a story about it, but doubling the pain by making it delightful. The task I set for myself was to make the reader not complicit in the pain, but instead an appalled recipient of it. One of the most striking examples of pain in fiction that I know of is Kafka's mercifully short story in the penal colony. I couldn't possibly read any of it to you now. I read it for the first time in a tube carriage, and there was a moment when I actually felt all the blood depart my head, and I had to cling on to one of the rails to stop myself from passing out. The story is told from the point of view of a government official tasked with observing a capital sentence carried out on a criminal. I will not tell you how that sentence is carried out, only say that it is grimly funny in its way, and that the narration has a kind of cold precision that will not allow the reader to take any pleasure at all in witnessing the trauma. The effect, actually, is to make the reader feel that we have been condemned too. I want to open one final drawer. There are more, which if we have time you can open for yourselves, and this one contains a large flint stone. It fits very easily into the palm of your hand and has been sheared off on the perpendicular, revealing a shining black surface. This is a stone I keep on my desk and which I found outside the ruins of the Abbey in Bury St Edmunds. Honestly, it was on the path. It was like that when I got there, officer, I promise. I keep it with me because it signifies to me a quality of the Gothic which has had an unshakable influence on me. How and why I came to write in the Gothic tradition is no great mystery when you think of my upbringing and my familiarity with ideas of transgression and then my drug habit a little later on. I could cheerfully occupy an hour or two on the Gothic alone, but I'll confine myself to two particularly important points. The first is that the word Gothic, when it was first used, and indeed to a certain extent today, was an insult. The Gothic has never been and will never be met by the literary establishment with murmurs of cerebral approval. It has always been thought of as vulgar, barbarous, indecent and unrestrained. I'm grinning because I quite like the fact that Strip Baptist has ended up inhabiting that space. The word was used first not in literature but by the Renaissance scholar Vasari. So Vasari was besotted with ideas of classical architecture, Doric columns, plenty of white plaster, the golden ratio. And he visited a Romanesque cathedral and was so utterly appalled by the flying buttresses and the pointy carvings and the pinnacles and the dark hiding places that he was appalled by its effect on him. And he said, this is like the Goths, this is like the Germanic tribes that physically tore down civilization in the sack of Rome. When Walpole published the first Gothic novel, The Castle of Otranto, when he called it Gothic, he was nodding to that and saying that what he was doing was taking part in a tradition of being anti-establishment, of being too much, of being likely to make civilized people blush with the presentation of the transgressions that they can see and that they can feel. The second element of the Gothic, which is the last thing I want to talk about, is very important and relates to the quality of the sublime. The critic D.P. Varma described the Gothic and the Sublime in particular as representing a quest for the numinous. And it's very interesting to note how the Gothic has tended to become popular in the aftermath, the immediate aftermath of periods of scientific rationalism. So the first flowering was post-Enlightenment, then you have a huge surge in Gothic fiction post-Darwin, and then we're seeing more Gothic fiction now in an age when, of course, Dawkins and so on would sort of brought about almost a cult-like dedication to rejecting anything that's strange. And for me, I think the Sublime offers a kind of space between the strict religious feeling of my childhood and my youth and the secular modes of thought which are commonplace now and which I've tried to adopt and never can. The Sublime inhabits a space which is beyond reason and is akin to religious feeling without being hitched to the supernatural, still less to the religious. It's Burke who first wrote about this and said that the feeling of the sublime is more analogous to terror than to an appreciation of beauty. It's very difficult to convey the sublime in writing because the act of writing negates that excitement of ideas which is beyond reason. As soon as you begin to grasp about for the language, you are applying reason to what is supposed to be unreasonable. The best writing which I have so far encountered on the sublime is from Annie Dillard's account of witnessing a total solar eclipse. The writing itself is strange and something very different from aesthetically pleasing. Reading it, you almost come close to encountering the feeling of sublime that she is describing. This is her. From all the hills came screams. A piece of sky behind the crescent sun was detaching. A loosened circle of evening sky suddenly lighted from the back. It was an abrupt black body out of nowhere. It was a flat disc. It was almost over the sun. That's when the screams began. All at once, this disc of sky slid over the sun like a lid. The sky snapped over the sun like a lens cover. The hatch in the brain slammed. Abruptly, it was dark night on the land and in the sky. In the night sky was a tiny ring of light. There was no sound. The eyes dried. The arteries drained. The lungs hushed. There was no world. I slightly hesitate to follow Annie Dillard with my own writing, which does not match up to it, but I'm going to finish by reading a very brief part of the Essex Serpent, which relates to the sublime, and also relates, I think, to what I believe art and literature can achieve, which is a kind of blurring of all the things that keep us apart from each other. The sublime has a quality of being able to lift us out of ordinary social conventions and manners and mores and take us to something which is almost kind of pagan, almost atavistic. I'm just briefly going to read, because my time is well up, a scene in which two people who have been arguing with each other in a way that all readers of novels will know what eventually signifies, and they see an optical illusion, and I will end there. They reached the water, the tide was out. Mud and shingle gleamed in the westering light, and someone had wreathed the bones of Leviathan in yellow branches of broom. Sedge grew in soft pale sheaves that shimmered when the wind took them. A little distance away, they heard the deep, implausible booming of a bittern. The air was sweet and clear. It went in like good wine. Neither was ever certain who first shielded their eyes against the dazzle on the water and saw what lay beyond. Neither recalled having exclaimed or having told the other, "Look, look," only that all at once both stood transfixed on the path above the saltings, gazing east. There on the horizon, between the silver line of water and the sky, there lay a strip of pale and gauzy air. Within the strip, sailing far above the water, a barge moved slowly through the lower sky. It was possible to make out the separate pieces of its oxblood sail, which appeared to move under a strong wind. There, quite clearly, was the deck in rigging, in the dark prow. On it went, flying in full sail high above the estuary. It flickered, then diminished, then regained its size. Then for a moment it was possible to see the image of it inverted just beneath, as if a great mirror had been laid out. The air grew chill, the bittern boomed. Each heard the other breathing swiftly, and it was not quite terror they felt, though something like it. Then the mirror vanished, and the boat sailed on alone. A gull flew below the black hull, above the gleaming water. Then some member of the ghostly crew tugged a rope or dropped an anchor. The vessel ceased to move, only hung on, silent, wonderful, becalmed against the sky. William Ransom and Cora Seaborn, stripped of code and convention, even of speech, stood with her strong hand in his, children of the earth, and lost in wonder.